We are going to start here with the Stone Cold podcast with Triple H that was conducted after Raw went off the air this past Monday night. What a surreal conversation. That was running through my mind the entire time. I mean, if you remember the Triple H that we saw on the original season of Tough Enough and the stories about how he hated that show. I remember reading those stories about how much he despised the original Tough Enough because of how it exposed the business. And here he is on their own network all these years later talking about baby faces and heels, the writers, giving guys the push, dirt sheets, smart marks. You know, it's pretty incredible to see where we've come from just in the last 15 years. I came away from this thinking three things. Number one, everything bad or questionable, blame Vince, not me. Number two, never have I heard someone say so much, yet say so little. Which is not to say that I didn't enjoy it. I did. It's always fun to watch these things. I thought it was a good interview, and he made some interesting points that we'll get into here. But there are times where it sounded as though he was just talking as a way to kill time or avoid actually answering the question. And number three, my final takeaway from this when it was over, Triple H is really stuck, I think, in a lot of ways until Vince steps aside. I really do think that there are things he would like to do that he is unable to do because he is not in a position to do it so long as Vince is around and Vince has final say on everything. He is still the ultimate voice. So when Vince goes, I think there will be some changes that are made. The question is, how big are those changes going to be? I don't foresee Vince, let's say, stepping aside or croaking or whatever, and Triple H and Stephanie now ascend to the throne and everything changes overnight. I don't think that's going to happen at all. But I don't doubt there are some big changes that will happen. How big they will be, though, I think is what we're all wondering. So, did he ask my three questions? I had three questions on the sound-off last week that I said Triple H must be asked by Stone Cold Steve Austin. Were they asked? Well, Austin did ask him about NXT. In fact, right out of the gate, he mentioned NXT, and then they kind of circled back to it. He did not, however, ask Triple H how he felt about guys that have made it from the main or to the main roster from NXT and have floundered, and there have been a lot, unfortunately. He didn't ask him about that. I would have been very curious because NXT is Triple H's baby in a lot of ways. He wants to see those people succeed. He invests a lot of his own time and energy, I think, into helping them grow and get over and to see them. Not everybody is going to succeed. A guy like an Adam Rose can go either way. Adam Rose was almost like a cult figure at NXT in front of that small crowd and his entrance and his music and everything, and then it just never worked out once he got made, promoted to the main roster. Now, can you just blame that on Vince McMahon and the writers, or was the Adam Rose character just never going to get over in front of a more mainstream audience, right? I could see that. I could see where maybe he just wasn't going to get over at that same level no matter what. But you can't tell me that other people like Emma, for example, who have all the talent in the world, could not be and should not be doing better than they are right now. And a lot of that has to do with Vince McMahon and his merry band of writers over there. I mean, that's just the reality of it. How does Triple H feel about that? That would have been an interesting question, I think, for Austin to ask. He didn't ask the question about Kurt Angle. I didn't think he would, and it's not really important in the grand scheme of things. Kurt's back with TNA, but I just would have been very curious to get his take on, what sort of issues, if any, he has or has had in the past with Kurt, and if he can verify what Kurt said as far as the conversations that were had when he was looking to come back recently to WWE and it didn't work out. So he didn't ask that. The third question, though, was his direct involvement in the booking of the Royal Rumble match, if he had any at all. How does he justify that? I think that was something to the effect of what I was hoping he would ask. He didn't ask that, but Triple H did say during the interview that the final decision was debated back and forth a lot, and ultimately it was Vince McMahon's call. So there you go again, right? Vince. It's all Vince. It's Vince's call. And we already knew that. Again, of course it's Vince's call. Everything that makes television is ultimately Vince's call. So he kind of passed the buck on that a little bit. He didn't really shed a lot of light on his involvement in the process or the planning, if any, of the Rumble match itself, but he kind of passed the buck on that question. Austin opened with a statement that kayfabe has died. So Austin, I think, is about 10 or 15 years late to the game on that one. But still very weird to just open an interview on the WWE Network with Steve Austin, right? One of the biggest stars in the business ever. Kayfabe has died. And then it just kind of goes into a whole conversation with him and Triple H about how kayfabe is a thing of the past and you pull the curtain back too much and it's just a different business now. So they had a lengthy discussion about that. Then they got into Roman Reigns and Daniel Bryan. And they spent a lot of time talking about Daniel Bryan, Roman Reigns, the reactions, everything that's been going on recently. Does Roman Reigns deserve it? Is he being picked on unfairly? All these different things. Triple H made it a point to say that Roman Reigns gets booed on television. Not by everybody, to be fair to Roman Reigns, but he does get booed by a lot of people at the TV shows. But Triple H says he gets nothing but cheers at the live events, which I also find hard to believe. I do believe that he gets a majority positive reaction at the house shows. And there are people who will send in house show reports who will go and will say Roman Reigns got cheered by everybody, John Cena got cheered by everybody. I mean, I've seen that myself. I've seen it at Madison Square Garden. I've been to house shows before. I was at one of the house shows the day after Christmas. It's become like a tradition at MSG. And this is probably about 2 years ago now. And John Cena came out at the end of the show, I think, for a cage match with Dolph Ziggler, who had Big E and AJ in his corner at the time. This would have been after the TLC pay-per-view where Ziggler beat Cena. Cena came out, and the place went crazy. It was mostly kids. It was mostly kids and women, which is not to say all the men were booing him, but when he came out, I would say the reaction was anywhere from 90 to 95% positive. The complete opposite of what you'll see on television. So I don't think Triple H was lying when he said that. But it's just interesting that they kind of throw that, oh yeah, well, at the live events, Roman Reigns gets cheered by almost everybody. It's probably families and kids, and that's just how it's going to be. I mean, in a lot of ways, I guess Roman Reigns is already on his way to being John Cena 2.0, right? He gets booed on TV and cheered at the live events. I don't know that they should really be all that excited about having John Cena 2.0 for the next 10 years. You know, you should want somebody that everybody can get behind and cheer for if he's going to be your guy, if he's going to be your top babyface. And I don't know, there's a lot of signs there right now between the promos he was doing over the last few weeks, getting those types of reactions. It's just eerily similar to John Cena. I just don't think that's a good thing. I don't think Roman Reigns should be like John Cena. I just don't think he should. Austin made a comment that he felt the finish of the Royal Rumble could have been booked differently to make Roman Reigns look like he earned it more. Maybe that has a lot to do with the backlash that he's gotten. And that's a fair point. Roman Reigns, when you really stop and think about it, didn't really do much of anything in the Royal Rumble. I know he did dump some guys out of the ring. His real star-making performance in the Rumble was last year when he set the elimination record. He came in at, number 19 this year and spent most of the time laying on the floor, in the corner. He didn't really do much of anything. And so there was a little bit of that, I think, and that people felt like he won the Rumble, but what the hell did he do? There were other people like Bray Wyatt who it just felt like did more in the Rumble match, and so that may have been part of why people turned on him. But there was a lot of talk, like I said, about Roman Reigns and Daniel Bryan and the fan reactions to them and all these sorts of things. And as they went on and on and on, and I'm thinking to myself, you guys only have an hour here. I know this is really relevant, but you've now spent the first 10 or 15 minutes talking about this. Can we please move on? As they're going on about this stuff, a thought occurred to me. And I'm sitting there and I think to myself, all this talk about the guy, right? That was what this conversation was about. Who's going to be the guy in WWE? Is Roman Reigns going to be the guy? Is that why fans resent him? They want Daniel Bryan to be the guy. And I'm thinking to myself, why does WWE even need the guy? Why can't there be 2 or 3 guys? Why does there have to be just one? They're always so obsessed over one guy. It's like that storyline they did on television last year, or maybe it was the end of 2013 with Orton and Bryan. Who is the face of WWE? Who cares who the face of WWE is? At least in terms of the storyline. Who gives a shit? Why should I care? Why should you care? Watching a television show, who do I care is the face of the company? That was a completely dumb storyline to begin with. When Stone Cold Steve Austin was on top, and you had Rock right there with him as the top babyface, and you had Mankind and Triple H, it's like, were they fighting on television every week to see who the face of WWE was? No. What a concept. They were fighting over a championship. I know, that's so old school of me to bring that up, but they were. It wasn't about who the face of the company was, who's going to be on the fucking Chef Boyardee can. It was real men fighting over things that mattered. And I think now there's this perception that we're not dealing with real men. We're dealing with guys that are kind of masquerading around as pro wrestlers, fighting over meaningless bullshit that nobody cares about. That, I think, is one of the biggest problems in WWE right now. But even behind the scenes, I think they just rely way too much on building everything, that whole company, around one guy. I think that's dangerous. How many times have we said over the years, if, God forbid, John Cena were to be hit by a car, or a plane went down, or there was some horrible accident that took him out of WWE, what would they do? There were many points over the last 5, 6, 7 years where the roster was very thin, everything was built around John Cena, and if one thing happened to this guy, they were fucked. Because they didn't have anybody who was even close to the kind of star that he was. Why would you even put yourselves in that position? Why wouldn't you try to build a second guy? And maybe a third guy to be on that same level? Why does it have to be about just one person? I think that's flawed. I think that's a big mistake. And I think they spend so much time obsessing over it. Roman Reigns has the look. He's a big guy with a big tribal tattoo and great hair, and he's got a great spear. Oh, this guy, we can build everything. We can build the kingdom around this guy. But wouldn't it make more sense to not just build Roman Reigns up at that level, but build Dean Ambrose at that level? Or build Daniel Bryan at that level, since the fans were already ready to embrace him anyway? That way you don't have to build the whole company around just, old goat-faced Daniel Bryan. You could build it around Bryan and Reigns, and maybe one other person. And rotate them out, depending on the storyline each week and each month as far as who you want to put the spotlight on. I think that would make more sense. So they went on in the interview. Triple H buried all of their older production guys at one point. It was hilarious. He was talking about NXT and how they train more than just wrestlers. They're training the next generation of producers and production people behind the scenes, and how he was looking off camera, pointing at all, I guess, the old production people that were in the studio that we couldn't see, and he was saying, all these old guys, they're going to be, replaced by the younger guys soon. And that was, I think, the first little dig there at Kevin Dunn. Would not be the last. And then we got into the Chyna debate. And this is what I want to spend some time on here, because there's been a lot made of the comments that Triple H made about Chyna. Steve Austin asked him if Chyna deserves to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And Triple H said absolutely. Unequivocally, does she deserve it? Absolutely. And he says he's got no beef with her. Things happened, he said. And then he went into this weird deal where, without actually coming out directly and saying so, he seemed to imply that it would be difficult for them to put her into the Hall of Fame because of her past in porn. Because Chyna has done hardcore porn. She's posed nude, she's done movies before, and so he is suggesting that, he actually said, if, let's say, I have an 8-year-old kid, and that 8-year-old kid hops on Google to learn more about who Chyna is, we can't have that, because God only knows what that 8-year-old kid is going to find. That was his argument. Let's start with this question of, does she deserve to go in? It's hard to sit here and talk about who deserves to go into the WWE Hall of Fame with a straight face, because the process by which these decisions are made is a joke. And I spent a lot of time answering a mailbag question about this recently, so go back a few weeks in the archives, because I'm not going to rehash that whole thing again. But yes, Chyna deserves to be recognized, and I'll tell you why. I see people saying yes or no, but not really offering any real substance as to why. I'll tell you exactly why Chyna belongs in the Hall of Fame, and I'm going to actually make a comparison. And please don't tar and feather me for this, because this is going to sound weird, but just bear with me here, okay? I'm going to make a comparison between Chyna and Miss Elizabeth. Probably the only time I will ever make a comparison of any kind between Chyna and Miss Elizabeth. But I make the comparison because with Randy Savage, when he came into WWE, he came in with Elizabeth as his manager. They built him up like a big deal. Every manager was clamoring for him, and in the end, out came Miss Elizabeth, who we had never seen before. She was this beautiful, gorgeous woman. You couldn't take your eyes off her. I mean, she was my first crush in wrestling, was Miss Elizabeth. Just the picture of class this woman was on television. And Elizabeth was a very big part of that act with Randy Savage. So much so that I can sit here right now and ask the question, would Randy Savage have gotten over to the level that he got over at without Miss Elizabeth, without her being in his corner, without her being part of that package? Now, I think Savage would have gone on, no matter what, to become a big star, probably a world champion at some point, whether it's just in WCW and not WWE, or maybe both, okay? He would have gone on to become a big star no matter what, because he was that damn good, okay? One of the best ever. He is exactly the picture of what a professional wrestler should be. In the ring, he could back it up. Out of the ring, he was even better. There was nobody else like him. He was such a unique character. He fit in perfectly in that era. So I personally think that Randy Savage would have been a big star. I mean, a big, big star, no matter what. That's my opinion, okay? But do we know for sure that he would have become WWF champion when he did? Remember, he became the WWF champion because Hulk Hogan was going to go away. He was filming a movie for a few months. I think it might have been No Holds Barred. They had to get the title off of him. And they came up with this great plan, this great storyline, my favorite storyline of all time, the whole Mega Powers storyline and the eventual split. It was all built around jealousy. Jealousy that Savage had because he perceived that Hogan was lusting for Elizabeth. He was lusting over the man's wife. The most cardinal sin you could think of. That whole thing was built around her. It was not built around Hogan and Savage. It was built around her. And I'm sure Hogan was fine with it because he knew he was going to get the belt back as soon as he came back, if the following year. And they had this story in place. You take Elizabeth out of the equation, that changes everything. That changes everything. Who knows if things play out the exact same way, with Savage getting the title when he did, and eventually feuding with Hogan. That's the sort of thing, it's a what-if question. You don't know for sure, but that could have changed the whole trajectory of this guy's career. Maybe he ends up being a big star, but not quite as big. Maybe he never wins the WWF title. Because even the second time that Savage won the championship, when he feuded with Flair in 1992, that whole storyline was built around Elizabeth. And the phony photos that got published in the magazine of Ric Flair with Elizabeth, remember, she was mine before she was yours. And then even at WrestleMania, when the match is over and Flair kisses her and Savage goes crazy, the two key storylines of this guy's career in WWF were built around Elizabeth. You take her out of the equation, who knows? Who knows where Randy Savage ends up in the pecking order there? And then eventually, going to WCW, where he was again reunited with Elizabeth after a while. That's how important a part of his career that she was. But I look at that and say Savage would have been a big star no matter what, okay? Why am I bringing all of this up? I know I'm taking a while to get to the point. I bring this up because I make the same comparison for Chyna and Triple H. In that, without her, without Chyna, I'm not so sure Triple H gets the chance to get over at the level that he ended up being at and then eventually marrying into the company. I'm really not. And this applies more to Chyna and Triple H than it does for Savage and Liz, because I still think Savage, like I said, would have ended up on top. I feel less confident about that when it comes to Chyna and Triple H. That's how important Chyna was to this guy's career. Okay, and you look at Triple H's career from the time he came into WWE until today. Triple H was never over enough on his own to make it, at least in the company's eyes. And the proof is right there in front of your face. You don't have to take my word for it. Just look at the body of this guy's career from the moment he came in until today. Now, when he came in, it was in 95. He was a mid-card. He was a mid to lower card guy. He was a good worker. He was not pushed as anything special. He probably lost more than he won. He was just a guy on the roster with a shitty gimmick. That's what he was. Fast forward to the end of 96 when they put the Intercontinental title on him. They put the title on him the same night they linked him up with Mr. Perfect. Remember, they did that whole swerve where they were building tension between them, and there was supposed to be a match on Raw. It was going to be Mr. Perfect's first match in years, And it ended up being a big swerve, and Perfect helped him win the title, and the idea was that Perfect was going to be this guy's manager and help get him over. Well, it didn't quite work out that way because Perfect was almost instantly out of the company after a contractual disagreement. He ended up going to WCW many, many months later, so he was gone. But they linked the two of them up with the hope that it would help get Triple H over. So when Hennig went away, their next great plan was to put Curtis Hughes with Triple H. Mr. Hughes, for a cup of coffee there, people probably barely remember it, was actually Triple H's bodyguard. And I know maybe even on his DVD, he talked about that and said Curtis is a nice guy, but this was not an idea that Triple H endorsed. He didn't like it. He didn't think it would work, and it didn't. It ended as quickly as it began, okay? But they felt they had to put somebody with him. So in the span of just, 3-4 months, he went from having Mr. Perfect in his corner to Mr. Hughes, and the month after that, Chyna debuted. And they finally found something that worked. And then you fast forward later in 1997, Triple H is glomming off HBK as part of DX. Thank God he was best buds with Shawn Michaels, because God only knows where this guy would have ended up if he wasn't buddy-buddy with HBK. So because of that friendship, it benefited him. They started the DX faction. That went on for a while. When Shawn went away, Triple H took over as the leader of DX. Fast forward a little bit more, and he's with Stephanie McMahon. They do that whole storyline. Now he's got Stephanie with him. And the whole McMahon-Helmsley regime. And then it became Triple H and Ric Flair. A few years later, they put Ric Flair in Triple H's corner. He had to be with somebody or surrounded by other people, be it Chyna, DX with X-Pac and the Outlaws, the corporation, the corporate ministry, the McMahon-Helmsley regime, the two-man power trip, which, with The Rock leaving, he was going to go film a movie after WrestleMania 17, really should have been Triple H's face turn, which they teased, and he ended up not turning face. They actually put him together as partners with Steve Austin instead. It should have been a babyface turn for Triple H with him feuding with a heel Austin after WrestleMania and letting that carry them for a few months. But instead they made them partners. Triple H now is with Stone Cold Steve Austin. He's not against him. And then, of course, Triple H got hurt, came back 8 months later, and he got a monster reaction at Madison Square Garden. I would hope so, given the fact that the guy was gone for so long. And he had the great comeback story. He won the Royal Rumble match. He beat Chris Jericho for the title at WrestleMania. And then what happened? A month later, they took the title off him and put it on Hulk Hogan. Now, Hogan was on the nostalgia trip at that point. He had just come back to WWE. He was gone for 9 years. The fans turned him babyface. I guarantee you, if that were Steve Austin, after having just won the title at WrestleMania, there's no way they would have taken that title off of him to put it on Hulk Hogan. Not a chance. But Triple H, on his own as a babyface at that point, was a bust. Nobody cared. There was nothing there. He was dull. He was boring. Why do you think they had to constantly put people with him and surround him by other people? Or surround himself with other people? I'm sure he had some influence in those decisions. Because he knew. He knew. They thought going with Hogan might be better for business short term. It wasn't. They took the title right off of him and put it on Undertaker. But that just goes to show you how well Triple H has done on his own. Back when he was in his prime wrestling full time. Thankfully for him, his buddy came back, right? Shawn came back in 2002. He had that feud going into SummerSlam. And then what happened after SummerSlam? They gave him his own belt, and they put Ric Flair with him a month later. And Flair spent years with him. And if you're not over with Ric Flair in your corner, then there's a problem. Then came Evolution, where the goal was to help get some new guys over. Don't think for a second, though, that Triple H didn't know that surrounding himself with these guys and putting himself right in the middle as their leader was also going to benefit him. Of course it was. And it worked. It definitely worked. People look back very fondly on Evolution. They made stars out of Batista and Randy Orton. It was a success. But yet again, Triple H surrounding himself with other people. And when that ran its course, and a little more time went by, then it was a DX reunion. Bring back DX with Shawn Michaels. And they did that for a few years. And then by that point, he was winding down. You know, he was a made man at that point anyway. He was wrestling less and less. But you look at his body of work, you see a pattern, and it all goes back to Chyna, because every association before her was a failure until she came along and she changed everything. I mean, that woman was a freak of nature. And I got news for you. She was more over for a long time than Triple H was. She was the real draw, not Triple H. For years, nobody cared about Triple H. They wanted to see Chyna. They wanted to see Chyna beat up some dudes. She was a star before he ever was. And so without her, again, it's impossible to say, but more so than with Randy Savage and Elizabeth, without Chyna, there's a good chance Triple H doesn't end up in the spot that he's in right now. Maybe he does because he was still friends with Shawn Michaels. You know, he still had that connection, so maybe he does. But maybe he's not quite where he is now, quite, you know, in the cushy spot that he finds himself in right now. Maybe he still ends up a big star, but not the kind of decorated champion that he ended up being in WWE. For that reason alone, the woman deserves a spot in the Hall of Fame. Not for being the first female Intercontinental Champion, which was the start of the decline for that title, by the way. You know, when she won it and they did the whole co-champion deal with Chris Jericho, that was the start of it. You know, and Jericho and Benoit and Eddie and those guys, they helped kind of bring value back to the title after that. But I don't think the Intercontinental title was ever really looked at the same after Chyna won it. But that's not why she belongs in the Hall of Fame. She belongs in the Hall of Fame because she played an instrumental role, as instrumental a role as anybody I can think of, in Triple H even being on a podcast with Stone Cold Steve Austin talking about this stuff. And look at where Triple H is. He's the heir apparent to the throne. He's a pretty important guy. There is no other reason that you can offer besides that one as the best evidence of why this woman deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. There it is. Now, the porn stuff and kids Googling her, to me, that's a cop-out answer, okay? If they don't want to employ her now and, like, put her under contract today because of her past in porn, that's one thing. But to honor her for her past contributions to the company, before that, before she even did any of that stuff, when you have somebody, for example, like Jimmy Snuka in the Hall of Fame, yes, Jimmy Snuka was never convicted in a court of law. I don't even think he was ever indicted. Most people believe, as I do, that Jimmy Snuka murdered, be it accidentally or on purpose, he murdered his girlfriend. And not after his career had already ended. This was in the prime of his career. This was like 1982, I think. 82, 83, around then. This is the prime of this guy's career. If we're going to go down that slippery slope and start getting into the act of Googling people in the Hall of Fame, imagine the stuff that kids are going to find out about Scott Hall or Jake the Snake Roberts. Holy shit. Think of all the things that guy has done over the years, and he's been pretty open about it. It's not very hard to do a Google search on Jake Roberts and come up with all these interviews, all of this really deep, dark shit that this guy has been very open about. It's scary stuff. What 8-year-old is Googling Chyna anyway? What 8-year-old is sitting around Googling the members of the Hall of Fame? If they're old enough to read, I think it would be far scarier to them to read some of the stuff Jake Roberts has done and said about himself over the years than it would be to see a naked picture or a porn video with Chyna in it. Which brings me to Sunny. I see people mentioning the fact that Sunny is now selling herself on Skype. And so therefore, how hypocritical of Triple H and WWE to suggest that Chyna does not belong in the Hall of Fame because people may Google her. Sunny was not, as best as we know, who the hell knows, she wasn't selling herself on Skype in 2011 when she went into the Hall of Fame. She was already in the Hall of Fame long before she started doing that. Here's the reason why the answer that Triple H gave was such bullshit. It's a little thing called Wrestling Vixens. Okay, VIXXENS. That should give you a sense of what this is about and what road I'm going down here. Okay, Wrestling Vixens. It was a website that Missy Hyatt started. This would have been around, I think, the mid-2000s, long before Sunny ever went into the Hall of Fame. And on this Wrestling Vixens website, Sunny posed for tons of nude photographs, a lot of which are still online. You could find them right now. Not only that, I'm pretty sure there were videos too. I vividly remember there being one video of Sunny totally nude with Missy Hyatt in a shower pouring milk all over their bodies. It's no wonder I became lactose intolerant. I came across this accidentally at the time. Of course, it was accidental. But no, this really existed. I don't know if the milk video is still out there. But go Google Tammy Sitch nude and tell me what comes up. You'll get tons of naked pictures of her. And yes, it's not as explicit as hardcore porn, but so what? You're still showing your tits and your ass for money. I mean, where do you draw the line on this? If your argument is we don't want young children to Google these people and see bad things, you would disqualify an awful lot of people from the Hall of Fame. I love how now WWE is this picture of class and respect. You know, such a classy organization all of a sudden they want to kind of build themselves up as. This is the same company that made millions of dollars selling basically their own version of softcore pornography in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I remember being in high school. I couldn't wait to get my hands on those Raw magazines with Sunny on the cover. She was practically naked in some of those photos. You had Marlena with her big fake boobs hanging out, Sable with nothing but a chain covering her breasts, doing Playboy for WWE. So did Chyna, by the way. They made millions off selling softcore porn to kids for years. And now they're the picture of class. Why not just give the real reason why Chyna is not going into the Hall of Fame or isn't already in the Hall of Fame? Because your wife doesn't want her in there. Plain and simple. You know, it's funny, in the interview I mentioned, Triple H said things happened with him and Chyna, and he says, I don't really want to get into it. Of course he doesn't want to get into it, because it's not going to paint the very rosy picture of Triple H or Stephanie McMahon. So let's just avoid that one altogether. That's the real reason. There's your answer. But this holier-than-thou nonsense, I don't know if he really believes that or if he's just spouting off the excuse that Vince McMahon gave to him about people Googling her. But give me a break. Once Sunny went in after the Vixen stuff, you lost that argument. So what you're saying is that penetration is the dividing line here. Sunny, no penetration. Chyna, penetration. Is that now in the bylaws of the Hall of Fame? Thou shalt not penetrate? The whole thing is just complete nonsense. That's the only reason I have a problem with it. Chyna helped make Triple H long before Mick Foley ever did, and for that reason alone, I would put her in the Hall of Fame. And all this other noise about porn and all that kind of stuff is just that. It's just noise. And they don't have a leg to stand on when it comes to that. Stone Cold also lobbied on the podcast for Michael Hayes and the Freebirds to go into the Hall of Fame next year in Dallas. I think that would be a most appropriate place for that to happen. He asked the question to Triple H, who was more influential in the business, the NWO or DX? And Triple H hemmed and hawed, and he said, well, you know, at the beginning when they first arrived on the scene, the NWO was a big deal. They were very influential, but longer term, of course, he went with DX as his answer. To me, there really is no contest here. The answer is the NWO, period. End of story. The question is, who was more influential on the business? The NWO is the only answer. Yes, it fizzled out when they added too many people to it, but the impact that one angle had on the entire wrestling business and how it helped sway the wrestling wars and help light a fire under WWF to be more competitive, and the even bigger example I point to, how many companies, including WWE, in the years that have passed following the NWO angle, have been trying to replicate that and copy it and try to kind of capture lightning in a bottle again, right? How many times have all of these different promotions essentially tried to have their own NWO? And by saying their own NWO, I'm not just saying anybody who ever tried to form a faction, but there were plenty of times over the years, whether it was the Nexus angle, which I thought was actually very well done, things of that nature, like an invading faction, and how many times have we seen that? And it all came from the NWO, because a lot of these guys grew up on that, right? They grew up on the NWO, you know, the performers, and even the writers and the bookers. I mean, they were around when the NWO was hot. Maybe they were even working for WCW in some cases when it was hot. And they've always tried to replicate that, and it never works. That right there should tell you how influential the NWO was. I don't see too many people copying a lot of the shit that DX did. And I'm not trying to minimize it. I enjoyed DX. I consider myself a DX fan at that time. Not the newer version. I thought that was just crap. But to compare the two and say which was more influential, I just don't see how you can say anything other than the NWO. That is the answer. Then Austin asked him about CM Punk, which I give Austin credit for. I didn't know if he was going to bring Punk up or not, but he did. And Triple H said that, and you heard the soundbite at the beginning of the podcast here. He made the comment that he had no beef with Punk. He said the storyline with Punk back in 2011 was done for the right reasons. It was done to help get him more over. That was the one point. Not that it was the only thing that he said that made me shake my head, but it was the one point in the entire podcast where I just sat there and said, "You are so full of shit. You are so full of shit." But, he was being corporate H during the interview. And never say never. When Austin said, would you do business with him again? Could Punk come back? And instead of saying what he probably really felt, he was like, well, I know we say it on TV and it sounds cliche, but if it's best for business. So Triple H is clearly learning from Vince McMahon here. But he's full of shit. And, you go back to the whole storyline in 2011, there was nobody in the summer of 2011, nobody who was hotter in pro wrestling than CM Punk. The guy was white hot at that time. He was the hottest thing in wrestling. I mean, there was really no higher that he could ascend during those few months after he beat John Cena and won the WWE Championship. And you think back to what they did. Triple H even then was kind of, sort of, mostly retired. He was not wrestling full-time anymore. In fact, before that, I don't even know. I mean, the last match he may have had before that, and maybe I'm wrong, but it may have been the match with Undertaker or WrestleMania. I don't even know if Triple H wrestled after that until the match with Punk, which was in September at the Night of Champions pay-per-view. I know the original plan had been for Punk to first wrestle Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash got to powerbomb him 3 times on television. Punk never got his retribution on Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash had some sort of issue. He was on medication for his heart, Plavix or something, and couldn't get cleared. Whatever the nonsense was that went on. The match never happened. I think the end goal was to do Punk and Triple H at Survivor Series. So instead, they did Punk and Triple H in September at Night of Champions. And, all the defenders will say, hey, he pedigreed CM Punk 3 times. It took 3 pedigrees. Some people, it only takes 1. And he beat Punk, yes, but it took 3 of them. Give me a break. He came essentially out of retirement at a time when he was already on television wearing the suit, being COO Triple H. He came out of retirement for 1 fucking match, and he beat the hottest thing in the company at that time. And then, I think, went right back into retirement until December when he came back out to wrestle his buddy Kevin Nash, who finally was cleared, and now he was able to wrestle again. Instead of going back and doing Nash and Punk, they did Nash and Triple H, I think in a ladder match, of all things, to put Kevin Nash in. But yeah, he came essentially out of retirement, out of the doldrums, to beat the hottest thing in the company at the time. And somehow, this was all designed to help get CM Punk even more over by beating him. Now, if CM Punk was a guy that was on the ascent, a mid-card guy, maybe even like an upper mid-card guy, was never quite able to break out as a real main event star on his own, maybe you can make that argument that by working with a guy like Triple H, even if he lost, he could get the rub and become a bigger star because of it. But in this case, it doesn't apply. Punk was already a big star. He had just beaten the biggest star in the company and won the championship. CM Punk did not need Triple H, but they did what they did. And if you listen to Punk's interview with Cabana, he brought that up, even in the meeting, that final meeting he had with Vince and Triple H, and he even turned to Triple H and said, listen, I resent you for what you did in 2011. You talk about this best for business crap. That certainly was not best for business. CM Punk was never as hot after that feud with Triple H. He was still one of the biggest stars in the company. He still had a huge fan base. He won the championship back a few months later. But I don't think that CM Punk was ever nearly as hot as he was for those couple of months in 2011 before they put him in that feud with Triple H and they beat him. He was never the same after that. So I guess if their plan was to get him even more over, their plan failed. So that whole thing about Punk and how he's got no problem with Punk and, it's all nonsense. I mean, I absolutely believe the stories that when the CM Punk podcast dropped with Colt Cabana, that Triple H and Stephanie both wanted to kill him. And I'm sure they both feel the same way right now. There's still a lot of animosity there. He can say whatever the hell he wants to say. There is no way that CM Punk is going to go say the things that he said about Triple H and reveal the things that he revealed about Triple H and how he reacted in the meeting with Vince when Punk was kind of nailing him on all these different things, and that Triple H is just going to take that and be like, well, I don't know, he was kind of misunderstood. I never had a problem. I still don't have a problem with Punk. I'd love to do business with him again. Like, please. So that to me was like, this guy is completely full of it. They went into some word association. Triple H said that Bret Hart, fantastic technician, but sometimes takes himself too seriously. I guess that's his little receipt for the Bret Hart comment about how Triple H has never had a really great match, 4 out of 10, all that kind of stuff. And also, not for nothing, he's kind of right. Bret Hart, as much as I love Bret Hart, Bret's one of my all-time favorites, he does tend to take himself a little too seriously. Triple H said that they are talking to Brock Lesnar. Austin wanted to know what's up with Brock. He says they're talking. Whether or not he stays is up to him. He feels that Brock may have unfinished business in UFC. He didn't say UFC, but that's what he meant. And then Austin asked him about the streak. Undertaker's streak coming to an end at WrestleMania last year. Does he think the streak should have ended? And Triple H completely dodged the question. He went into this long-winded answer. I get the sense that if it were up to Triple H, that streak would not have come to an end. In fact, I'm pretty sure Triple H had done an interview. Maybe it was on like did they do like an Undertaker streak DVD set or something? I vaguely remember Triple H in some sort of interview a couple years ago even saying that, like, just from a marketing perspective, it would have been complete suicide to end the streak. And I'm sure if it were up to him, it probably wouldn't have happened. But he didn't say that. So they got into a discussion then about the Super Bowl finish. Talk about surreal. Here I am watching the WWE Network, and of all people, Triple H and Steve Austin are having a discussion about the finish of the Super Bowl. And they're talking about that, and they start playing the music as though they're trying to play these guys out, like we're out of time here. And Austin's in his earpiece, they're winding me down. And Triple H is like, who is it? Is it Vince? And Steve says no. In his ear, he goes, it's Kevin Dunn. And Triple H basically, in so many words, said, fuck Kevin Dunn, we're going long. If you can go long with Vince, you can go long with me. And I laughed. And I've talked about this on the Sound Off before, as the stories go. Triple H and Stephanie both are not fond of Kevin Dunn. And I don't know if Kevin Dunn feels the same way about them. They are not Kevin Dunn fans. And the moment that Vince McMahon is gone, because Vince will always keep Kevin Dunn employed, the moment that Kevin Dunn, or rather Vince is gone, Kevin Dunn is going to be gone not too long after. Because Triple H and Stephanie have been putting their people, they've been hiring their own people in various departments. You know, when the time comes, it's going to be a company full of their people. They want to run things the way that they want to run them, and it makes sense that they would bring in their own people. And Kevin Dunn has been there for so long. I mean, the guy is a fucking relic. So, I absolutely believe that Triple H is not fond of Kevin Dunn. And then here we are on this podcast with him making these little comments, and you can kind of tell it came through that he's not exactly a Kevin Dunn fan. Austin went on for a little longer with him. He asked about promos, if is it that they don't trust talent to go out there unscripted and do promos, and Triple H basically said, yes, they have sponsors to consider, which is basically just saying we don't trust these guys to go out there and say something they shouldn't and get us in a whole bunch of trouble, so we have to script everything out. I still think that's just really, really counterproductive. There's got to be a happy medium in there somewhere, whether, again, it's bullet points or it's just less scripting. Just the way they do things now. Some guys can nail it. There's, for every Dean Ambrose who seems to be able to go out there and cut a promo and not sound completely rehearsed, you've got a Roman Reigns telling a nursery rhyme story. Or you've got, I'm trying to think of somebody else who's like just not a good promo on the roster right now. I mean, I think back to poor John Morrison back in the day. I still kind of rip on him. As talented as he is, he was a terrible promo in WWE. And it doesn't look like he's gotten much better. But I just think the over-scripting is one of the other big things that's wrong with WWE these days. Besides the just focus so much on the guy, this is the other thing that's just killing them. It's just the over-scripting of everything. Triple H said that if it were up to him, Monday Night Raw would go back to 2 hours. I was very happy to hear him say that. He says it's a Vince McMahon call, though. So there it is again. Throw Vinnie Mac under the bus. He goes, I'd go back to 2 hours in a heartbeat, but it's a Vince McMahon call. And it's a Vince McMahon call because of money, I think, more than anything else. USA Network is paying them probably quite a bit of money for that third hour. I've heard $700,000 thrown around. I don't know if that's factual or not, but it's a lot of money. At a time when they're cutting costs and they just launched a network that nearly put them into debt. So money has to be a consideration, I suppose. But God, if Raw were to go back to 2 hours, I'm not going to sit here and say that all of a sudden it would be a great show and it would solve all their problems. And I had one person on Twitter defend Raw being 3 hours by saying the show is actually much better at 3 hours because without the 3 hours, they'd have less time to work with. You still have promos you got to do, and so therefore we wouldn't get some of the longer, great wrestling matches that we've gotten. It's a fair point in this respect. I don't think that if Raw was 2 hours, we would get as many great matches as we've gotten under the 3 hour model. But that's a sacrifice that just has to be made. That doesn't mean you can't have a 2 hour show with some damn good wrestling matches, even if it's just the main event. Even if you don't have time to have great long matches up and down the card because you got promos and a lot of guys you got to fit in there. So you have one great match every now and then instead of having them more frequently. So what? It's just killing the show in so many other ways that I would gladly take the 2 hour model back in a heartbeat. And I was happy to hear Triple H say it. He was saying it in the vein of it's also freaking hard. It's hard to book and script a 3 hour show as opposed to 2 every single week. So it's not just what we're seeing on television, it's just the work that goes into it, especially when you have a madman at the helm who is no different now with 3 hours than he was at 2, apparently, and any given Monday afternoon, 2-3 hours before the show, he'll throw the whole script in the garbage. Now you got to rewrite an entire 3 hour show. That can't be easy. But that was one of the big revelations to come out of Triple H's mouth during the show. He says he wants more women to get more time and more dedication on television, which is something I'd like to see as well. On sports entertainment, Austin won't let this go. He hates the term sports entertainment. It was funny watching him and Vince quarrel over it when he kept saying wrestling the last time Vince was on, and Vince is like, it's not wrestling. And Steve kept catching himself, but in his head he's like, dude, it's wrestling. So he brought that up to Triple H, and Triple H says, we call it sports entertainment because people hear pro wrestling and they don't know what that is. The funny thing about that statement, most of the time, neither does WWE. So that was the Triple H interview. It's worth it. The network is free. I can't tell you it's not worth it. It's absolutely worth it just to watch it. It's just insightful, not just to hear it. I think you got to actually watch it. Sometimes it looks like he's squirming in his chair. Other times he looks more relaxed. It's a good interview. I don't know if I enjoyed the Vince one more than this, maybe just for the sake that we never ever hear Vince in that kind of form. Triple H, we heard him before on Chris Jericho's podcast and stuff like that. So this was not like groundbreaking stuff the way that the Vince one kind of was. But it was still fun.